Right, I think we are good to go. I forgot to unmute myself there. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're from. I know we have representatives from over Europe, and I think I saw India in the chat panel, so it's great to see that we're having such a broad reach in these times. You know, one of the benefits of this situation is that we have been able to increase our audience by making the events remote. We do obviously hope to have in-person events back as soon as possible, but as you know, it's very difficult to say when that will be at the moment. My name is Chris. I'm the current president of the UXPA, so I just have a few introductory comments to make. UXPA UK is the local chapter of UXPA International, which is an international organisation which supports UX practitioners, and we obviously focus on the UK. We are run entirely by volunteers, so we all have roles in industry, either full, part-time, permanent, contractor, freelance. So we have a lot of experience among us. We normally run in-person events. Obviously, the circumstances of the past year have made that impossible, so we've been keep going remotely, and as long as you keep attending and joining us, we will make sure we keep producing these events for you. We also have a mentoring scheme which is still ongoing, and that's running throughout the year. So if you are interested in that, if you check out the mentoring section of our website, that will give you the details to get in touch with Sharon, who's looking after that scheme at the moment for us. And just a note on mentoring, we're always looking for new mentors. So if you are at a stage in your career, perhaps where you are wanting to progress from a junior to a senior or a mid-level to a senior, a mentor doesn't need to be a lead or a head of UX. A mentor is someone who can give someone who's 2 or 3 years kind of behind them in their career path or their experience, who can really give them valuable advice on how to progress and move up to that next steps. And obviously a lot of leadership is about mentoring, so it's a very valuable skill and asset to have. The best way to keep informed about our activities is on our monthly newsletter, which you can sign up by going to our website, which is uxpa-uk.org. Our next event is, so a date for the diary is remote again. It's on March the 25th. We have a speaker from the USA, Justin Dower, who's going to be speaking about the fusion of culture and design. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Michaela Lewis, who is one of the new members of the committee. She joined in January as the academic and student liaison, and is also, I believe, producing some sketch notes of this event. So a big welcome and thank you to Michaela. Just a brief overview of how we're going to run the evening. It's slightly longer than our normal remote events and more in line with the format of our in-person events. So we will have, after Sophia has given her talk, Sophia is an evangelist, so she will give a broad overview of the subject, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and we will invite Gabriela and Imogen to contribute before they talk about their specific case studies in the second half of the event. When asking speakers, if you could use the Q&A function, because that's the best way for us to keep track of questions that need answering. We'll try and keep an eye on the chat panel for other issues you may be having, and also in the Q&A and break section, if you want to and feel confident and comfortable, feel free to raise your hand and we will unmute you so you can ask your questions, and hopefully we'll get a bit of discussion going among the speakers and attendees and try and create that in-person event experience. That's enough from me. I want to say a big thank you. UXPA UK is, like I said, we're a community of volunteers and we work as a team. And I just want to say a big thanks to Rik, who's done such a great job to put such a fantastic event together about such a fascinating topic. So I've been involved with UXPA UK for a number of years now, and we've had events on some very fascinating topics, and object-oriented UX is one of them, or OOUX, as I've been calling it. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Rik, who will take you through the event from now on. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Yes, as a UX architect, this event has been a joy to curate. We'll be exploring OOUX tonight, which is a philosophy, and ORCA, which is a design process in user-centered information architecture, or IA. Information architecture is a taxonomy, ontology, and choreography of data-led experiences, and it's the backbone of any product design process. It orders and influences everything that we design and build. And crucially, the IA happens whether we design it or not. But as I've just alluded to, IA can be chronically overlooked, both in terms of project delivery and as a UXer skill set. Also often project teams skip IA and jump, hopefully from user research, into detailed interaction design. And this is a real problem because IA methods and processes, like OOUX with ORCA, detangle, define, and inform the creation of systems which truly match a user's real-world mental model. And this, of course, maps back to Jakob-Nielsen's second usability heuristic, that there is a match between the system and the real world. So our first speaker, we have three great speakers for you tonight, but first up is Sophia Prater. Sophia is OOUX Evangelist in Chief at RewiredUX consultancy in the United States. She consults within organizations with really juicy experience design problems, and she also runs the OOUX podcast and the OOUX Strategist Certification Program. Previously, she's led UX at Coke, AT&T, the Australian Tax Office, and she delivered the design of CNN's 2012 election site for the US election. Tonight, she's going to be giving us a primer in OOUX, and specifically the ORCA design process, which she created. After her primer and a break, we'll have Imogen Levy, who is head of digital at Europe's oldest and largest eye hospital, NHS Moorfields Trust in London. Imogen has led digital design delivery at large, complex, and ancient organizations like the BBC, Westminster Abbey, Greater London Authority, and Alzheimer's Society. And tonight she'll be discussing her journey to object-oriented UX and how she's midway through applying the ORCA process to transform NHS Moorfields. Gabriela Ospina will be closing our event tonight. Gabriela is a senior product designer for Clark, a German consumer fintech who matches customers with the right insurance company and the right insurance policy. And she'll be drawing on her project library from Clark and JP Morgan and others to take us from theory to practical implementation with tips and shortcuts in the ORCA process. So we've got a really great evening, strong foundation from the horse's mouth and two great practical case studies. And that's really all from me. So over to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Rik. Thank you. This is, I think, the closest thing that we have so far to an OOUX conference. So I am just overwhelmed by all of us coming together here. I mean, we truly are creating an OOUX community, which is pretty amazing. And I am seeing this as definitely, this is a precursor to maybe some sort of OOUX conference next year. Very inspiring to see that more and more of us are going to have stories of how we are actually using object-oriented UX, like what you'll hear from Imogen and Gabriela. So I'm very excited to hear their talks and see how it's playing out in the real world. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as we do. And thank you so much for the introduction, Rik. So I'm going to breeze through my introduction. So we're going to talk today about getting curious about complexity, which is a big thing that OOUX helps with, helps you actually dig into complexity without fear and with a whole lot of confidence that you can take on that complexity, which is a lot of what us UX designers deal with on a day-to-day basis. We're sort of, I will talk about this, I think I'll talk about this later. I kind of call us the complexity Tinkerbells. Like we have to take in all the complexity so that our users don't have to deal with that complexity, or that complexity is as understandable as it possibly can be, that we don't have any extraneous complexity. That's what we don't want. We want to eliminate complexity that doesn't have to be there. And object-oriented UX helps us do that. So as Rik so kindly introduced me, I am a UX designer, a UX coach, and I consider myself the chief evangelist for object-oriented UX. I wrote this article back in 2015 that maybe some of you have read. Maybe some of you are actually practicing object-oriented UX based on this article. Things have changed a little bit since 2015. We've got a lot of updated thinking that I'll be sharing with you today, at least some of that updated thinking. There was a few follow-up articles that I wrote on a list apart. I'm continuing to write on Medium. When travel is a thing, I get to go and speak about object-oriented UX all over the world and deliver it to companies. So I go into companies, I train design teams in object-oriented UX. Also host things like the object-oriented UX happy hour, which Imogen will be speaking at March 3rd, I believe. So make sure to sign up for the object-oriented UX happy hour. I think later today, we are going to be putting up her talk. It's going to be sort of a longer, even meatier version than what she's talking about today. So if you want to go even deeper with Imogen, make sure to sign up for the happy hour. Sorry, shameless plug. Also have the object-oriented UX podcast, as Rik mentioned, and the certification program, which Gabriela, Imogen, and Rik were all part of cohort 3. So this is a rigorous 10-week course that I kind of take you through with I hold your hand the whole time, and we go through the entire OOUX process, which you will get to see a whirlwind tour of that today. So why OOUX? How does it help you break down complexity? So I look at a lot of portfolios. I do a lot of mentoring. Here I'm from, my adult growing up was in Atlanta, Georgia. We moved up to the North Georgia mountains. We're about 90 minutes outside of Atlanta, but I ran Ladies at UX in Atlanta for quite a while and for quite a few years. And so I looked at a whole lot of portfolios. I also ran the UX Hustle Summit conference. So I do a lot of mentoring, and I see portfolios a lot that look like this. This is a loose abstraction, a replica of a portfolio piece that I saw, almost like pixel for pixel here, but wanted to protect the innocent, of course. So I'm looking at these screens, these low fidelity screens for a redesign of the membership for Zoo Atlanta. And I'm thinking, okay, you click on membership, you see the benefits of membership, you click join, you fill out your form. Thank you for joining. You are a member now. And I'm thinking, is there really just one level of membership? Is that how Zoo Atlanta works? So I pop over to zooatlanta.com, and within moments I find this. Find the membership that's right for you. And I've got the companion, and it costs money, actually, right? You actually are supposed to pay to become a member. So basically what we're seeing here is not satisfying business rules. It's low fidelity, but what we often do is we sweep complexity under the rug in the name of low fidelity. And what this does is this just creates rework later. I mean, all these screens need to be thrown out. These don't work. This is not how you would sign up to be to be a member. So what we want to avoid is low functional fidelity early on. We want to get into the weeds as much as possible, figure out all of these pieces of complexity before we start wireframing. And that is a lot of what object-oriented UX helps you do by breaking down your complexity by object. So what we would do here to kind of cut to the chase is we would first identify membership level as an object, is a repeatable thing that has value to the user and to the business, right? So membership level, that's an object. It's got structure. We'd start pulling out that structure, right? Title, amount deductible, guest tickets, band cost, whether you get a passport or not. And we'd start collecting all that structure, and we would review this collaboratively, completely agnostic of display, all right? Because who knows, this might be an Alexa skill, right? All right, to figure out your membership level, who knows? So we're gonna completely separate it from display, as the good people that worked on HTML and CSS did back in the 90s. Was that the 90s, 80s, 90s? So we know that this is a good idea to separate our content from display, but we often don't do that in a real way. And object-oriented UX helps you do that. So we pull out the object and we figure out the data behind the object, and we talk about it with our subject matter experts, with our stakeholders, with our developers, even with users. We get users involved here and we're like, is this the stuff you want to see? Is this the stuff that's important? And of course, we're not just looking at the existing system. We're looking at competitors. We're looking at comparative analysis. We're looking at user interviews, and we're pulling together a structure. And through this process, we might say, oh, that passport thing, like, that's legacy. We don't even do that anymore. I don't even know why that's on the site still. But you know what should be there is the brew at the zoo price. That is what we know that people really care about that. So let's add that instead. And that's all well and good. This is all very valuable, but where OOUX really starts to shine is when we start to introduce other objects. So we have a member level, but in this just small ecosystem of membership within the zoo, we also have member accounts. And we need to figure out what is all the information we need, email address, physical address, payment information, which was missing from that low fidelity screen. Maybe date joined, might be some metadata that we want on there. And we start connecting those. So what we're building here is an object map. And we'll go into just a little bit more about an object map. I don't want to get into all the nitty gritty on it, but basically what we're doing here is we're starting to show relationships between these objects. So a member account has one member level. And I might actually have a little bit more of a conversation with the stakeholders about this and say, well, or maybe even my users, imagine that. And I might say, well, do you want to see your past member levels? Because I'm guessing some members are going to be changing member levels. So do you want to see like a history of all your member levels? So you have one current member level, but do you also have 0 to many past member levels? Do you want to see your history? I might add that too. So we might identify that as a question through this process and kick that back into research. And then from the member level position, connection goes the other way too. So a member level has many accounts. That's probably from an admin only perspective, right? Probably only administrators would see that. I wouldn't go into my account and say like, let's see all the other people that have this same member level. That might be kind of silly. Now, also through this process, we might be talking to the business and we might find out that there's a really big problem as well with aligning camp discounts, summer camp discounts for the kids with your member account. So it's what may be done really manually. A lot of it's done through email right now or spreadsheets that go back and forth. And they might say, it would be really great if underneath a member account, we could log different family members, usually the kids, sometimes senior citizens as well. And that could help you also see what your discounts are based on your membership level and also help you sign kids up for these different camps. So now we know that a family member has one parent member, a member account has one to many family members. And by adding this new object of a family member to a member account and connecting the data in a way that makes a lot of sense with the whole summer camp ecosystem, we are now providing serious value to the business and the user, right? We're providing systemic value. We are digging into the weeds. We are digging into the complexity, and we're not just moving UI around and not just prettying up UI, all right? If any of you are stuck in a situation where you feel like you're doing too much of that, you're moving the UI around too much, you're working page by page, you're not thinking about the whole system, this might be a really good answer to some of those problems. So one of my favorite testimonials that I hold near and dear to my heart is a woman coming out of a workshop, an OOUX workshop. She had about 2 years of UX experience and she was working in a really complex environment. I think it was insurance or healthcare. And she came out and she said, I feel like I can tackle any level of complexity now. I know how to break down a problem. And so how do we break down a problem? How do you break up complexity? Feel free to put that in the chat. I'm not looking at the chat, but feel free to talk about that. How do you break up complexity? Can you answer that in a few words? Do you break it up by noun or verb? You might think, well, I don't know, neither. What about this one? Do you break it up by object or by task flow? Task flow, feature, user story, functionality. Is that how you're breaking up complexity now? And if so, how's that working out for you? Does it all make a lot of sense? Does it, when you break up your complexity by task flow, by action, by verb, does it all end up fitting together into a cohesive whole at the end? Or do you sometimes end up with some sort of hodgepodge, Frankenstein, kludgy design? All right. Or another way to put this is, do you break up complexity by concept or by component / UI? which is how we're doing a lot of that work now in design systems. And I'm going to bring this back to design systems in just a few, but we're putting a lot of effort in trying to solve for complexity. We're putting a lot of weight on our design system. Like our design system is going to help us do that because now we have a pattern library. Now we have Lego blocks that we can use, and that's going to help us have consistency. And it will, but it's going to work a lot better if you are first dividing up your complexity by concept, by noun, by object. So this is what OOUX is all about. And this is what I would call traditional UX, which is a little bit of a stretch, right? Because nothing is traditional. We are all pioneers here. We're all figuring this out. But more of what I see at the companies that bring me in, this is how they are working. And it's not working so well for them, breaking up complexity in this way. And they found a lot of benefit in starting to break up complexity another way. All right, so why? Why does it work better to break it up by noun versus breaking up by verb? And this is not to say that one is more important than the other. Actually, my caveat here is at the end of the day, verbs are more important. Yes, don't quote me on that and take it out of context. Verbs are more important because at the end of the day, users need to get stuff done. But they're going to get stuff done a lot easier if they understand what the nouns are in the system. And we connect those nouns and verbs together really nicely, and we figure out our nouns first. So I'll get into that a little bit more later. So why noun? Why object? Well, this is how databases work. So databases are usually designed by noun at the macro scheme. All right, this is how your developers most likely are already kind of thinking. They're already thinking by object. So this is going to help you interface with your developers and collaborate with your developers in a much more meaningful and streamlined way. But it's not just devs and databases that think object-orientedly and work object-orientedly. It's people, human beings, all human beings. So I'm not going to get too much into the psychology because if I start talking about it, I won't be able to stop talking about it. It's super interesting, but I've written a couple articles on this. But basically, if you come with me with the idea that when we go to understand our world, we need to understand the objects in that world. So if you imagine you go into an environment that you've never been to before, you start figuring out what the things are. In the physical world, we just take this for granted. Our visual cortex does a really good job of doing this, even for those that are visually impaired. The visual cortex is basically saying, what are the things here? Where are the things? And what are the relationships between those things? That's what the back of our brain is doing. Not quite the lizard brain, but like right on top of the lizard brain. So our brain has been doing that for a really long time for survival. And this is if you think about our language. For those that have kids, feel free to put, or nieces or nephews or grandkids, feel free to put if you know, if you remember first words, put those in the chat. Leave out mom, dad, and no, because no is another very common first word. But go ahead and put other first words in the chat. I'm guessing I'm going to see a lot of, I'm not looking at the chat right now. I'm probably seeing ball, cat, dog, snack, that kind of thing are usually our very common first words in the English language. So this is how we sort of teach our kids. It's us too. We're with a small child at the lake, and we say, duck, that's a duck. Right? We say, that's a duck. We don't say, that's swimming. We don't do that. Or that's flying. We identify the things, and later on, we start identifying actions and procedures. So there's a lot of really interesting research on this. This is another article. I would read the other one first, but this one here, and you guys have the slides in there. It's linked up in the slides. But this one here is super interesting. It's about children that grow up in environments where the language that they're growing up in is more verb friendly than noun friendly. So the English language is a noun friendly language. There are a lot, especially more tribal languages. There are lots of these languages that are actually more verb friendly, but it turns out kids still learn the nouns first. All right, so it's very intrinsic in us. So if you want to get more into this, if you want to geek out, look at those articles. And if you find any other research, feel free to email me, message me. I would love to talk about this. So if you come with me on this fact, I will go ahead and say a fact that humans think in objects and users are human, and so are you. So this is a very important way, or very important to basically internalize so that we can start designing this way. All right, so I'm going to go over 3 of the 4 OOUX laws, because we only have a little bit of time here. So if you want to dig into this, I'm going to, of course, be telling you some more ways in the chat after I finish talking, some more ways that you can learn about object-oriented UX. And like, if you are ready to go dive into the deep end, we have ways for you to do that. So the first law of objects is very simple. Because we think in objects, we need to be able to recognize objects. Objects need to be recognizable. And the best way for objects to be recognizable is different objects should look different. That's simple. And in the physical world, this usually is true. Different objects look different. In the natural world, if 2 things look the same, it's because nature is tricking us, right? So we have like the snake that tries to look like a stick and stuff like that. So usually those are edge cases, right? But usually in the natural environment, different things look different. In the digital environment, though, we do stuff like this, right? So we do stuff where we think that we're being very efficient here. We create a homepage tile or a slider card or something like that, and we say anything can go in this. So in this case with LinkedIn, we have a person, a group, a company, and a hashtag all wearing the same outfit. These are fundamentally different things from a user's mental model. They are different things within the domain of LinkedIn, yet they are all looking exactly the same here. And this makes them hard to differentiate, to parse. We have to use slow thinking. We have to read. We have to realize also that connect is very different than following a company. So we have these 2 CTAs that look very similar on cards that look very similar, but the actions actually do very different things. This is not good. We don't want to do this. Here's another example from Lamps Plus. Love me some Lamps Plus, but they have these, nice generic homepage or promotion tile, maybe is what they call it in their design system. I guess promotion tile sounds about right. But they're representing different things. A room category, a tool where you can put your dog on this light. That's pretty awful, isn't it? I digress. A sale and a curated collection. These are very different things. Now, some things like a curated collection versus a room category, maybe Lamps Plus doesn't care if you know the difference between those. But if you do care, if Lamps Plus were to care that you know the difference between a curated collection by an expert within Lamps Plus versus a room category versus a sale, then they're going to want to visually differentiate these a little bit more. Okay, so what about the flip side? So you might be thinking, well, that seems like a whole lot of extra work. It's okay. I'm going to save you work on the other side. So on the other side, we have the OOUX law of attributes. So here, this is saying that objects that are the same should look the same. Okay, so while objects that are different should look different, objects that are the same should look the same. Our visual cortex is really good at saying that thing, this can looks similar to other cans that I've interacted with, so I know exactly how to use this and what to expect from this can, right? This is how, or from this mushroom, or from this wild animal, right? So this is how we have survived for a really long time, is internalizing the fact that objects that look the same are usually the same. Unfortunately, we create what I call shapeshifters. So the previous ones, we call those masked objects. They're basically wearing masks. These we call shapeshifters, all right? So stuff is just moving around arbitrarily. So here's GoDaddy. We have my domains versus expiring domains. And we just have information mixed up. Some like the ability to sell a domain, or the estimated price of a domain is here, but not over here, which if something is expiring and I want to renew it, but I see like if I saw it could be worth $1,300, that might be really good information to show here. How do I know that these are arbitrary changes? Maybe somebody was really thinking about this. All right, I see stuff like this. Expires on 4/17 versus cancels on 4/17. So we have 2 different labels. I mean, look about your language too. And what happens in the human brain is when things are different, we're going to try to attribute meaning to that. And if there is no meaning there, for example, in this case, because it's the same domain with the same date, so I know it doesn't mean anything different, expiring and canceling is the same thing, but they're using 2 different labels, one's red. So imagine these were 2 different domains and 2 different dates. I might have some issues here thinking like, well, what's the difference between expires and cancels? Like, and you're making your user do deductive reasoning. Even UI is different from here versus there. Everything's mixed up and changing around. And what's happening, like what I'll come back to this and say here is what is happening here is the designer is working too hard because the designer is designing two things when there could probably just be one thing that works well in both places. Because the designer did double work, now the developer has to do double work. Now QA has to do double work. Now maintenance is a little bit harder too, because we have two things instead of having one thing. And also, this is harder for your users. This is extra cognitive load. All the things that I was just mentioning, your users are just having to track this, track all of these changes. Another example here, Amazon, just have yourself a little party. Maybe Friday night, get yourself a glass of wine and just go and do screenshots of all the different product modules within Amazon.com. So if we just look at price here, so sometimes it's in red. Why is it in red? It's not because it's on sale. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small. It changes positioning. If we just look at a few of these, because I know that's a lot to look at, we can see name, price, just the ordering of these attributes. We have name, price, and star rating. Then we have name, star rating, and then price. And then we have price, name, and star rating. So the user is having to constantly relearn where these pieces are. All right, so the third law, the OOUX law of CTAs, all calls to action should be clearly connected to the object that is being acted upon. So my friend, and I will say intellectual mentor, Andrew Hinton, says in his book, Understanding Context, which I highly recommend, we are agents taking action in our environments, and we have to understand those environments well enough to take appropriate action. How do we understand our environments? We understand our environments by recognizing all the objects that make up these environments. All right, so he goes on to say, for a long time, technology has been chipping away at the immediate clarity of context. Contraptions that separate a specific action from its effects, most of these changes have happened slowly enough that we can keep up with them. Most of these changes, until now, right? So if you think about light, an object that gives you light, we originally had fire in it. Even though we didn't understand exactly how fire was working, we knew how to turn it on and off for the most part, right? And it was very connected to the action that we were taking. Then we get electricity. And at first with electricity, the mechanism for turning that electricity on and off was very directed to the source of light. We had a pull chain or a switch or something like that, some sort of circuit that was right there next to the light. And then we had light switches. Can you imagine? I don't actually know when light switches came out. I should research that. But can you imagine when light switches first came out? You would go to somebody's house that, you know, light switches were this newfangled thing. It must have been pretty confusing or pretty, wow, I turn it on here and the light all the way over here turns on. And this is actually still sometimes confusing when you go to somebody else's house, maybe even some places in your own house where the light switch is in kind of a weird place. And it says, and you think, I've been living here for 4 years and why don't I just learn this? Because the action and the result, the object that is actually being affected by that action are so separated. And now we take digital objects. And with digital objects, something like location services. What happens when I turn on location services? Do you think my mom understands what happens when she turns on location services? I mean, this is affecting multiple different objects. It's not clear exactly what objects are being affected. And it's happening outside of the house, outside of my city even. Things are being affected. There's this kind of cascading effect of complexity when I'm turning something on and off. So we do things on the internet, and often we don't know what we are doing the thing to. And that is the call to action here on calls to action, is how can you close that gap as much as possible? So we talk a lot in OOUX about affordances, the affordances on the objects. That's what I call calls to action, are basically the object calling the user to some sort of action, saying, hey, this is something you can do to me. And this talk here by Jean-Jules Jensen, oh, what a name, this lovely Danish woman, I believe. She did this talk in 2013. I just discovered it, and this is linked up in the PDF. She says, when she's talking about affordances, she said, you're able to look at something and immediately realize how it's supposed to be used. How many of you, hands on heart, can say that's how it is with your software? Oof. Oof. Okay, so a little bit on design systems. Rik, how am I on time? I'm not timing myself. Rik or Chris, how are we doing?
I think
you're go for it, Chris.
Yeah, good to go. Keep going.
Like 10 more, do I have 10 more minutes? 5 more minutes?
Let's say 5 to 10.
5 to 10. Okay, perfect. Awesome. I didn't pay attention to when I started talking. All right, so thank you for that. So OOUX is not your design system, but how do they work together? So when we go back to breaking up complexity, OOUX, we recommend you break up complexity by this concept we call object concept. I use those terms interchangeably, versus by component. And I'll kind of go back on that. I think that both are important. We need to actually break up complexity in both of these ways. The design system helps you break up complexity by component and UI. But what you want to do is first figure out the concepts that your components and your UI are representing. So you don't want to just willy-nilly start going and figuring out what all your components are. You want to root them clearly in your concepts, right? So you don't have those masked objects. You don't have those shapeshifters, all right? And you can say, these are the objects that are valuable to the user. Now, what components and what UI do we need to represent those, right? Because OOUX is not your design system. OOUX can actually, in this way, help you inform your design system. And it's very important to differentiate. These are components, not objects. So when we're talking about objects in the OOUX world, we're talking about the real world valuable stuff, the stuff that your users are coming for, all right? Nobody's coming for this stuff. So I like to say your users are not coming to your app for your calendar picker. It could be the best calendar picker in the whole wide world. They're not coming for that. They're coming for the event. They're coming for the thing. So always come back to what are your users coming for? What is making money for the business? What is valuable to the business? What is valuable to the users? Those are the things that you want to make sure your UI and your components are well representing. So I fully recommend this article. I know I'm throwing a lot of resources at you. This is actually a really quick read, like a 4 or 5 minute read. And Emmett Conley, I actually have run an OOUX workshop at Intercom. And so they're kind of thinking this way. And he has this article called The Full Stack Design System. So you can Google that. I didn't link it up it's easy to find if you, there's also a podcast episode where he talks about it. And he says, here's a little mystery. Why is it that, a bit like hangovers and pop music, most products somehow get worse with age? You think the opposite should be true, right? So why is this happening to us? Why is it after we work on a product for so long, it gets worse? It should be getting more, like end up with this like paragon of elegance, after we keep whittling away at it, but the opposite seems to be true. So the upshot that Emmett Conley, who is a leader in design systems, as well as Dan Mall, who is a leader in design system, is sort of pulling back to is that we need our design systems to be specific. And the way we don't just need, have this box of parts without any instructions on them. All right. We need our design systems to be specific. And the way to do that is to root them in those objects. All right. So I highly recommend also another shameless plug to the OOUX podcast. I did interview Dan Mall and we had a real geek fest talking about this stuff. So like I said at the top of the presentation, UX designers are the Tinkerbells of complexity. We need to drink the poison so our users don't have to. All right, so hopefully you're with me there and you're kind of thinking, all right, maybe breaking up by object might be better than doing this by action flow or task flow or wire flow, user flow, whatever you want to call it. So how do we actually do this? How can we be better complexity wranglers? So, I bet you're not surprised. Object-oriented UX. So this is a philosophy for designing digital systems that respects the fact that people think in objects. And so all we're doing here as OOUXers is we're deliberately aligning the software to the user's real-world mental model. So we're really figuring out what are the things in your world, especially this problem domain that we're trying to solve for, so that when a user comes in, those things are readily apparent. It's a secret weapon for breaking down complexity. Do it by object. So here's the manifesto. Here's what we do before designing any screens. We answer these questions. What are the objects in the user's mental model? Figure out what they are. right? So you can represent them clearly and consistently and make them recognizable. What are the objects' relationships to each other? So we make sure to map them to each other, one, to help define them, and two, to actually help build contextual navigation. This should be your main navigation, is actually helping users navigate through the relationships, not through some static list on the top or the sidebar. You still want that static list, that global navigation, but it shouldn't be your main driver. You shouldn't be relying on that to get your users around your system and around your digital environment. What calls to action do objects offer users? So what are those affordances? Are those affordances really clear? These are the things that you can do to me as an object. What are the attributes that make up those objects? All right, we need to make sure we understand those attributes and we prioritize those attributes really nicely, so that when we go and we represent the object in different areas of the environment, we're not moving things around arbitrarily. We're not sort of picking and choosing and haphazardly pulling metadata, pulling core content into those objects. We've got a really good idea on what the chemical makeup is of these objects. And so this aligns to the very most wonderful acronym in the whole world, ORCA. All right, and I'm just going to take you through 4 rounds of ORCA in about 4 minutes. I'm just going to really buzz you through, and you're going to see a lot more on how this works with Gabriela and Imogen. All right, so the ORCA process, basically go through 4 rounds, and we're hitting each of these pillars, the O, the R, the C, the A. We're hitting each one every single time. So we start with discovery. All right, in discovery, then we go to requirements. Often in discovery, we're smoking out complexity. We're finding out all the questions that didn't get answered in research. Often we're popping back to research before we go into requirements. Requirements, we're untangling the complexity. We're putting everything under a microscope. Then we go into prioritization. So that's where we're actually prioritizing from a user and a business perspective. So not just positioning on the page, this piece of information is more important than this piece of information, but this piece of information needs to be released and developed and released before this piece of information. And then we finally get to representation. So 3 rounds of ORCA before we start sketching. It seems crazy, right? But this is a very scalable process. You might be thinking, this is a 15-step process, Sophia. It's crazy. This is wild. But you can really burn through these, all right? So you can spend 2 weeks on it. You can spend 2 days on it. You can even spend 2 hours on it. That would be really, really fast. All right, so during object discovery, we do our noun foraging. So we go and we look at all of our research and we find the nouns that get used over and over and over again. During relationship, we put them on blue sticky notes. It doesn't work unless you put them on blue sticky notes. The sticky notes have to be blue. During relationship discovery, we do some system modeling. Your developers are going to feel very at home there. And then we do this nested object matrix, which is kind of like relationship battleship. It's pretty cool. Then we go into our CTA discovery. We figure out our roles. So we define all the different roles within the system. And for each of these roles, we start thinking about, well, what does each of these roles want to do to each of these objects? And then for attribute discovery, we start structuring all of our objects. We come up with that metadata, that core content. We figure out what that chemical makeup is. Then when we get into requirements for objects, we actually build a glossary on steroids. We call it an object guide. We have definition, purpose, ownership. New bullet points get added to this all the time. It's really, again, making sure that you're very intimately aware of all the pieces of your object and that your entire team is agreeing on this. During relationship requirements, we kind of put each relationship under a microscope. We think about the mechanics. We get more into the cardinality. How are things going to be sorted and filtered within the context of another object? Geeky stuff. We pull our CTA matrix from discovery. We pull it over into a spreadsheet. So it kind of grows up a little bit. And we start adding things like the why and the when. So when in the journey would they be doing this? What is their motivation? Can we really articulate their motivation for taking this action? And this basically gives you all you need to write really great object-oriented user stories. And then attribute requirements, we pull everything from our analog sticky notes or kind of light, loosey-goosey Miro or mural board. We pull it into Trello and we do things like adding whether fields are required. We add actual values to start thinking about taxonomy. We basically go into a lot of detail for each of the attributes. Our metadata gets metadata. It's very meta. And then prioritization. We prioritize our objects. I'm just going to flip through this. We prioritize our relationships with nav flows, and we prioritize our CTAs from a user perspective, as in how far does the user sort of have to reach to get to that CTA? Can the CTA just sort of be on the card, or is it okay for it to be a click away on the detail page? And then attribute prioritization, we're actually force ranking all of our objects and deciding that, okay, even though in this particular example, live stream might be very, very important, but it's not going to get released until phase 2. But when it does get released, it's going to be near the top of the page. So we're doing some kind of fancy stuff with actually prioritizing our attributes. And then with representation, we sketch using card, detail, and list sketch sheets. So it's a really efficient way of sketching. Build a clickable prototype, whether that's an Acture, Figma, or Sketch, and InVision, it doesn't really matter. We pull that into just make it clickable. So we're not doing any interaction design. We're really just showing here's all the objects and how they hook together, and here's what the CTAs are on those objects. And we test that first before going in and testing a bunch of designing and testing a bunch of UI that we might not even need that object. So we really validate our objects before going into a lot of UI work. Okay, whew. Do we have time for questions? That's all I have for you. And I am really excited to hand it over to Imogen and Gabriela after the break. But yeah, do we have any questions? Do we have time for questions?
I think what we'll do is we'll take the questions that have been asked in the Q&A panel, but obviously bring in the other speakers if they want to contribute. So now is the time, everyone, if you're listening in, to take a comfort break or grab some refreshments. What we'll do is we'll take a few questions now. The session is being recorded, so obviously if you do miss anything, it would be available later, but we want to try and stimulate a bit of discussion. We do need to keep some sort of time, but 10 minutes should be fine for questions. So do the speakers want to pick out which ones are perhaps the most juiciest and most interesting for them all?
Oh, I have a Q&A panel. Okay. Let's see. Oh, how would this work for a portfolio site? I'd love to. So wait, are we doing questions? I'm sorry, Rik. Are we doing questions now, or are we doing them after the break? Or both at the same time?
I was deep inside the chat. We can do some questions now, and people can take a break, and we'll come back at, is it 30 after, Chris? Or
so questions and break are happening at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Multitasking.
All right, wonderful. So how would this work for a portfolio site? Thank you, Sheila. So it would work very well for a portfolio site. I will give a plug for if you Google the UX Portfolio Power Play, that's a OOUX strategist, Amanda Worthington. She actually teaches a course on creating a portfolio and using object-oriented UX. But think about, what is it that makes you you? So I see so many portfolios. Guess what's along the top? About, projects, and contact. Let me know in the chat. Guilty? Anybody guilty? About, projects, and contact. One type of object, which is project. You're not actually creating an experience. So think about, what are the objects that really make you unique? So maybe it's places that you've worked. Maybe it's books that you've read. Maybe it's mentors that you follow. Having those, or skills, case studies. I mean, case studies, of course. So you could have at least projects, case studies, and skills as objects, and figuring out how those all interact. And now all of a sudden you have a much more robust portfolio, and you have a much more unique portfolio, and you actually have an experience where somebody's not just like pogo sticking between like the list of projects and the project, and then going back to the list of projects and going to the project, and going back to the list of projects and going to the project. Webflow is great for that. I highly recommend Webflow. Okay. Monica, how long does each phase actually take for a small e-commerce site? It depends. It's always going to depend. I say that you probably shouldn't spend more than a month or two at the maximum for a really complicated system. This work, it fits. I kind of put it right in the middle of the double diamond. All right. So you do your research, And then the ORCA process is really great. It's kind of a gauntlet to see, do I need to go back to research? So all together with your company, you are figuring out all the unknown unknowns, and with your stakeholders, with your business folks, so they understand the complexity too. And they understand, oh, we are working on some high risk assumptions because we just unearthed all of these questions, and it's going to be really risky for us to go into screen design before we go into research and answer those questions. So it kind of depends on how much research have you done, how much good research do you have. If you have really great research and really clear requirements, and you don't have business people arguing with each other on priorities, you might just be able to fly right through this. But if you don't, you might get stuck. You might definitely get stuck in a good way, helping mitigate clashing priorities, realizing that you need to go back to research. And again, that's going to save you time in the long run, right? It's going to save you from building products that people don't like. It's going to save you from building features that people don't need. But the entire ORCA process, just to give you, I would say, like, if you spend a week or two on it, you're going to be doing so much better than if you hadn't done that. So that's the other thing about OOUX, is it's very scalable. A little OOUX is better than no OOUX at all. If you can spend one day on it, then like it's going to make your life easier. How do you uncover the model in your user's mind with research? So thank you, Simon. That's a great question. Noun foraging is very helpful. So again, figuring out those objects, this is great for figuring out the business model too. So if you're starting in some sort of field that maybe you don't know much about, if you're a consultant, I was a consultant for a really long time. So I would get dropped into super complex situations, and I would start reading case studies, Wikipedia articles, and I would read them through the lens. I'd often print them out, and I'd get my blue highlighter, and I would start circling the nouns. And I would see, ooh, this is a noun that I don't know what this is. Maybe I should go do more research. Maybe I should ask somebody, hey, what is this? Or I start seeing things that might be synonyms, but I'm not sure. So I like to give the example of, I was working with a company that helped, it's called Blood Relay, and that's basically what they would do. So they would take blood samples from the hospital to the lab and back. And they built software basically for hospitals and labs to communicate on shuttling blood samples. And they would use the term sample and product kind of interchangeably. I couldn't really tell in all of our conversations as I was trying to figure out this domain that I knew nothing about. And I asked, is a sample and a product the same thing? And one person says yes, and the other person says no. People, like the two founders of the company are like, yes, no, at the exact same time. And then we had to have a conversation about that, really parse it out to understand the difference between a sample and a product. So our end users in that situation were nurses and lab technicians. And we had to figure out, okay, how do they think about sample? Like, what is a sample and a product for them? How are they related? So a sample has many products that can be derived from it. I had to understand that to build software for them that match their mental model. I get the blood sample and I can take multiple products from that blood sample. So hopefully that helps. Let's see, let's try to, do we have time for one more?
I just wanted to invite Gabriela and Imogen. Are there any other questions there? Obviously, I understand you're going to be talking about your case studies, but if there are any questions that you would like to add to at this point, I think that would be really useful to get the perspective from all three of you.
I wanted to pick up the, I think it was Simon's question as well, like how do you uncover the models in your users' minds with research? Just because we've been doing that with so many different people at Moorfields, and we've been using research interviews, transcripts. And I think I'll touch this on in my talk in a second, but really it's about using stuff that has both words that your audience is using to describe you, and how your business is describing your users, and both of those things are really important. I think it's getting that balance and using research data, looking at survey data, looking at emails that come in as a really good source, looking at social media comments, look at what are people saying about you. All of that is where your noun foraging should be starting from, and that's how you can start teasing out and we've been doing workshops where actually we just throw a bunch of words at people and say, look, this has been taken from our website, this has been taken from our Facebook page, please identify the objects and talk about what ones you think are important to you. So that's kind of one way we've been doing it, but I'm sure there are other ways.
Sophia, did maybe want to take one more question from the panel?
I thought that Andy's question about how does a UX object have anything to do with a UI, and how the intersection between objects and informing design would be a really good one to dig into.
Yeah, so Andy says, how does a UX object have anything to do with UI? The UI is a minuscule fraction of the whole experience. So I guess the relationship between these is, I think of the object as that real world thing that we actually, and then we use UI and components to represent that object. So often I will make the analogy of the substance versus the packaging. So let's say you are selling orange juice. Now let's say you're selling laundry detergent. You're selling laundry detergent. First, you want to say that the user, this is what the user wants. The user wants laundry detergent, right? And then you build the packaging for laundry detergent, and you put the brand. So you want it to be on brand. You want it to be ergonomic. You want it to not spill. You want it to be able to pour it and everything. That's your UI. That's the packaging, right? That's the thing that actually the user is touching and interacting with. The laundry detergent is the stuff that they really want, right? That's the stuff that they care about. Another way to think about this is I often get the question what about the cart in an e-commerce situation? Is the cart an object? And I say, no, it's not. The cart is not an object. Think about when you go to the grocery store. Are you going to the grocery store for the cart? The cart helps you, right? The cart is a means to an end. It's not what the user is coming for. They're coming for the product. They're coming for the food. That's the actual stuff. So kind of go back to what are users actually coming here for, and what is just a means to an end? All right. And then UI versus component, that's there's also the stuff that is behind the calls to action. So as a user is kind of going through a flow where you're actually having communication, the system and the user are communicating back and forth, that I kind of put that on the other side of the CTA. So what we do in OOUX is we first identify what are those affordances, and then later interaction design helps us achieve those affordances. It helps users actually achieve those affordances or do the actual things. But OOUX figures out what those affordances actually should be. Does anybody else have anything on that? Object versus UI?
No, I think that's probably a good point to kind of close this Q&A and this session and move into Imogen's case study about how she's wrangling NHS Moorfields into submission.
Cool, thank you. Right, I'll start sharing my screen, and hopefully you will all see my slides. Cool. So yeah, for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on my object-oriented UX journey into OOUX. Do we say OOUX, or are we saying OOUX or object-oriented UX? It's really hard repeating that over and over and over.
Okay, well, I feel like we should do a poll and see who likes it more.
Put it in the chat.
Yeah, definitely OOUX.
Now on in.
OOUX for me all the way.
I feel like OOUX is the the British version of it, and it, over here in the States we say OOUX. Oh, because we go OOUX.
So OOUX it is, just because it sounds really fun. So this is what I'll cover. I'll introduce myself really briefly. I'll introduce the NHS in about 30 seconds, which is going to be a challenge. I'll talk about Moorfields, so that's where I work. And I'll talk about my role and the digital vision for Moorfields, because really understanding the context of what we're trying to do at Moorfields and the challenges that we're being faced is why object-oriented UX or OOUX was such a good idea. So I have to explain the context because it doesn't make sense without it. A summary of our journey at Moorfields, and as Sophia said, this is kind of high level, and I will go into a little bit more detail at her happy hour. So really it's kind of just screenshots of some of the process and what we've done so far. Currently we're actively in the ORCA process, probably round 4 I think, or the fourth go at it. And we are working on some really exciting stuff. So I just want to talk about where we're at in our journey and where we're going next. And then I'll finish up with just saying some of the thoughts and things that Moorfields has gained from OOUX and what I have personally gained from learning OOUX as well. And then we'll jump to questions. So hello, I'm Imogen Levy. I have quite a background in working in lots of digital teams for amazing organisations. And my digital career really started when things weren't called digital, everything was called new media, and I spent my days designing interactive CD-ROMs that go in the back of books or coding in ActionScript, RIP, Flash. I've worked in local government, the charity sector, and now find myself working within the UK's National Health Service for a specialist local NHS trust. So the NHS is not just one organisation, it's a really complex matrix of many organisations. And I'm not going to go really into the depth of it, but just focusing on those kind of three main areas. So providers, so those delivering services directly to patients like GPs and trusts. And this is where I am sitting at the moment in my role as head of digital for Moorfields Eye Hospital, which has been a world-leading eye centre for over 200 years. And its main focus is the treatment and care of NHS patients with a wide range of eye problems, from common complaints to rare conditions that require treatment not available elsewhere in the UK. Its NHS operation is at over 30 locations in the UK, with a flagship main hospital in central London, as well as 2 other hospitals in the UAE, in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. There's also a private hospital in central London, which offers all the same treatments available in the NHS and some additional treatments, including cosmetic and laser eye surgery. Both the private and the NHS hospitals in central London treat over 1 million patients every year and consists of a 3,000 strong workforce. Its purpose is working together to discover, develop and deliver the best eye care. So I started at Moorfields in October 2019, so only a few months before kind of COVID really hit. And it was quite an interesting start to a new job because I started in a new role. So the digital team didn't exist. Head of digital was a new role created. Obviously Moorfields recognised the need there, which was really good, but I came with no team and no budget, so it was quite an interesting start in an organisation as a head of quite a senior role in an organisation with no team and no budget. But even on day one, I saw a huge potential for real change and transformation, and so for the past year, that's really what I've been doing. And OOUX has very much supported us on this change agenda. But I can't talk about OOUX without mentioning some of that wider context, as all of the work to date has been developing a digital vision for Moorfields and its patients. So my remit and vision for Moorfields encompasses 3 different areas. Firstly, culture, always a hard one to get right, and really the cornerstone of any successful transformation, whether digital or not. This is about implementing user-centered design service approaches to supporting our patients that's cross-organization, multidisciplinary, with an uncompromising focus on needs, and completely shifting how the organization currently does digital and how it thinks about it too. Education, this is about empowering staff at all levels of the organisation to build skills in all aspects of digital. In a way you can't have the culture without the education piece. But building skills from the ground up is no good unless you have buy-in from the top. So you need both of those approaches. And also product development. Using technology in the most appropriate, accessible way to deliver digital services and products for our patients across their entire end-to-end journey. Oh, and also growing and embedding a new digital team with a full stack of UX resource. Just a few small things, really, no biggie. There are a few key challenges which frame this context in which OOUX is actively trying to help us solve. I guess the overall challenge which I'm faced with is that Moorfields is a world leader in eye care, is international, groundbreaking in terms of clinical care and research, and yet experienced at the local level by its patients. So how do you create an experience which is both international and local, that from a brand perspective reflects the excellence of Moorfields in its clinical delivery and research, and also create an experience for patients which is truly tailored to a patient's local context condition and is cross-siloed in its approach? A really big challenge is one of content. In fact, I would argue that this is a problem across the entire NHS. We have a very insular way of structuring, labelling and designing our content. Plus, we are very wedded to NHS terminology and we expect people to just know it. Content is rarely designed with end users anywhere in the process, coupled with a huge reliance on inaccessible formats like PDFs. The NHS really does love PDF, and a lazy approach to publishing with little consideration into how content is absorbed, experienced by its intended audience. I would say that having a solid content model strategy is the backbone of any successful product, and OOUX can certainly help here with its relentless focus on what's absolutely critical to both the users and the business. At Moorfields, we have a big content challenge. The IA is messy. The current site has just been added to over the past 8 years, meaning it has a huge amount of out of date or redundant content. Plus there's over 16 different websites of the ones that I know about, all of which have separate CMSs, separate suppliers, little or no tracking, certainly no integration, and a huge amount of content duplication. If you search for the definition of cataracts, for example, you'd find 30 different definitions to work with. It also doesn't reflect a user's mental model of how they are experiencing what they're going through in their condition. One of the foundations of OOUX is to do exactly that. Accessibility is a key driver here. One of the first things I did was commission a full accessibility audit of the two main patient-facing websites, that's the NHS and the private website. And it was rather telling, failing to be compliant at the most basic level of the WCAG standards and presenting key challenges to our patients, many of whom are vision impaired. There is no support for assistive technology, and the majority of the content, as I said, is in PDF format. In fact, there's very little HTML. In addition to that, we have a huge reliance on printed materials. One patient told me she received 45 pieces of paper over just 1 year of being a long-term patient at Moorfields. And I asked her how many she read. She said, not many. So like all good philosophies, object-oriented UX all start with discovery. And in parallel to conducting the accessibility audit, I did kick off a piece of patient discovery. All of this data then becomes essential ingredients for the noun foraging process later. We also conducted a full content inventory across the sites and kickstarted a full and thorough content audit across the two main Moorfields websites and over 10,000 individual assets. It was clear that we needed a new radical approach. Cue OOUX. I was introduced by OOUX by Rik, who organised this talk, who's a good friend of mine, who suggested it as a way of untangling the complex content conundrum we face at Moorfields. I was pretty immediately sold on the value this process would bring to Moorfields and became slightly obsessed with learning as much as I could, as quickly as I could. I asked Rik to design and run an introductory workshop for some of the stakeholders at Moorfields, which would introduce them to the concept and prime them for launching the OOUX process later on, as well as evangelizing a strategy for content rethinking. It's always good to have someone external come in and tell your stakeholders what to do. Somehow they listen to others. In the workshop, we reverse engineered a Guardian article and asked them to identify objects, metadata, and content. And although the concept of breaking down into objects was easily understood, there was a challenge of understanding around what is content and what is metadata, which presented an interesting challenge. Getting people to restructure and relabel content is one thing, but getting them to think about the implications for finding, searching, sorting, filtering content is quite advanced. A very, very softly approach was needed here. This is a great quote from one of the attendees, actually someone in the marketing team, who really enjoyed and got value from the workshop. So this is great. This is starting to throw out some ideas about how we could approach things at Moorfields, and seeing it really land quite well was really encouraging. Shortly after that workshop, I attended the OOUX summer school, which was in August, as all of this was starting to kind of generate some interest and ideas. A great 2-evening course which covered a whistle-stop tour of the entire OOUX process. I was so pumped from doing it. I ran the entire OOUX process again with my colleague at work in the following week. And here's Orca run through number 1. I'm still quite proud of what we did in that week, to be honest, and a lot of that early thinking has really been validated through running the process again through the cohort, and a third time with patients and stakeholders. We're aiming for a 4th run through before the end of March. I wonder if anyone else has run it so many times, but we do have a lot of stakeholders to include at Moorfields. I signed up to cohort 3 pretty swiftly following the summer school, and through running the light process again with my colleague, I was keen to delve deeper in order to unlock some of the other tools and processes that I could directly apply to the thinking at Moorfields. It didn't disappoint, and the beauty of the cohort for me was being able to bring this real life project into the mix and gain the insight and value from a wealth of UX experts from across the world. The only downside was the time difference. I did not get used to the 10 PM UK starts and was not usually very coherent in some of the breakouts. I know cohort 4 is more at learn at your own pace, so don't get put off by that. But as Sophia explained, the OOUX process is the acronym ORCA, which stands for Objects, Relationships, Calls to Actions and Attributes, and follows that 4-phased approach of discovery, requirements, prioritization, and sketching or representation. So here was the second opportunity at the cohort to go through the process again for Moorfields, but with the support of the course and Sophia alongside. I carried on the process of replaying every session with my colleague in the week following each lecture, partly so I could cement the learnings, but also to train my team at the same time. I'm now hoping to put one of them into the cohort 4. This has been hugely beneficial and also helped with that education piece I mentioned at the beginning of training. I was learning, I was doing, but I was also empowering my team and the people around me to benefit from that as well. I've actively been talking about OOUX at any opportunity, and I'm co-leading a community of practice within the NHS on user-centered design, and we're having a session in April about OOUX. I've also convinced another NHS org to embark on the OOUX journey, and I hope this will spread, and maybe there'll be an NHS cohort in the future. So the first step on the OOUX journey is my favourite part of the process, noun foraging, literally as fun as it sounds. For the first run through of ORCA, I used raw patient interview data. For the second run through, I used a mix of user research, our dense 5-year strategy paper, as well as web content. And in the cohort, we were encouraged to limit the number of objects to 5, ideally up to 7 as a max. And my second noun foraging led me to 7 objects. And some real conundrums with definitions. It's all fine until you have to define something. There is a good test if something is an object in the ORCA process using the acronym SIP, S-I-P, structure, instances, and purpose. Plus, if it's a real thing in the real world, it's definitely going to be an object. The biggest conundrum I had at this point was between condition, treatment and service. Service in NHS is a complicated word. We use it to describe pretty much everything. Condition seemed a little bit easier to define, something which can be diagnosed by a medical professional, has structure, instances in this case, cataract, squint, glaucoma, for example, and is definitely a real world thing. Treatment and services become fudgy. The treatment definition I had initially was a procedure like surgery done to the thing which has the condition, in this case, eyes. It does have structure instances, i.e. surgery, injections, therapy, And it also exists independent from conditions in certain circumstances. I'm thinking here about cosmetic treatments, which aren't directly related to a condition. Services, again, even more fudgy. How do you define services when it's a label for everything that NHS does? Some of the instances of Moorfield services are A&E, counselling, mentoring, pharmacy, contact lens subscription, not sure, starting to get some fudgy definitions. At least the other four seemed obvious: patient, consultant, appointment, location. When I first saw the OOUX system model, and here's an example of where I tried to do 7 objects, it was a bit of an unruly mess, to say the least. I was quite intimidated at first, but I have come to love applying this early thinking into relationships. But it's only been recently in show and telling this process back to my colleagues away from the cohort that I've really learned its value. And in laying the foundations of interaction design and challenging colleagues to think about how objects relate to each other could be quite an interesting and fun conversation. So when I looked at the objects in when I looked at the relationship of my 7 objects, I was still haunted by this treatment versus services conundrum. They are different, but also the same. A treatment is usually described as a service, but a service can be a treatment and something completely different, like A&E, which is an emergency service, or a counselling service, etc. As we move into the C part of OOUX, the evening class that week had a session on roles versus objects, which was a bit of a light bulb for me in terms of my 7 objects. I was not building a patient portal or a social community system. So in the context of my system, patient could be a role. Huzzah! This means I'm now down to 6. Yeah, except that when I went through the call to action exercise, I found 5 more. So now I'm back up to 11. But for the purposes of the course, they got parked for the time being. Apparently, this is a normal part of the OOUX process. The CTA discovery should and will bring more objects to deal with. The beauty of the C part of OOUX, for me, is the direct relationship with user stories. I'd already captured user stories following the user research we'd done back in April. So I used this process to cross-reference these and to align to object thinking. It's also a helpful part of the process to help you think about some of those other roles, admin roles, for example, and not just the patient-facing ones. The A of OOUX I found surprisingly difficult. I thought it would be really simple. What are the content and metadata which make up your object? Easy, right? Well, in my object list, I was really stumped by appointment. What kind of content would an appointment have if I'm not building a system which handled appointment management or booking? Got very confused with that one. So the round 1 is discovery, round 2 is requirements. And this is where the OOUX process becomes really meaty and detailed. And you can, in this phase, you create what's called an object guide, which really lists out all of the different synonyms, the definition, the purpose, the ownership, the top level lists, an estimate on how many instances you might have in the system, and some instances examples for each of your objects. This is detail. This is great. This becomes a useful crib sheet for later on. You also consider the relationship requirements around the nested objects. You start writing the relationships as sentences, and this is where it becomes really useful to cement what you're talking about and how to describe it. You detail the mechanics of the relationship, what's called the cardinality, some of the sort and filters. You also create a CTA matrix, and here's just a screenshot of an example. And you define your attributes as well as considering your permissions by user type. If you are a detailed person, then this is the phase for you. For Moorfields, I'm currently designing a requirements validation workshop to start re-engaging patients and stakeholders in this phase. They've already been involved in defining the objects, in helping us think through the relationships. Certainly the CTA, so this screenshot on the left is taken directly from a patient workshop we did, where some of the actions you can see have directly been translated into our CTA matrix. And what I'd like to go is go back to the business and to our patients and get them to do some validation on some of the definitions, and also some of the prioritization and some of the attributes that we've got. So that's coming up in the next few weeks. I'll skip the third round and jump to the fourth round of sketching, or representation, as Sophia calls it. As my role is more focused on UX and digital strategy, I'm not super quick with prototyping tools. I usually call upon Rik to help me here, but I'm an avid painter and crafter, and so I went to my crafting roots to find a solution to OOUX prototyping and found the answer in felt. Anyone remember fuzzy felt? Well, now meet OOUX Fuzz. It was Christmas time and I've been doing a lot of Christmas crafting, but it did kind of make sense. It's easy to make, it's easy to move objects around, and actually it took me minutes to come up with multiple different layouts in which sketch it would have taken me days. I'm actually hoping to do an in-person sketching workshop soon with my team, as long as lockdown ends at some point. And if anyone wants a kit, let me know. I'm sure I could make you one. And I'm hoping that there's a product in here somewhere, who knows. So once the cohort was over, and we had already gone through the ORCA process twice for Moorfields, we decided to do it all over again. This time including patients, as I said, as well as stakeholders in the process. So now that's once on my own in 2 days, once with my team across 10 weeks of the cohort, and now with our end users. And we're at sort of about 12 weeks, and partly because we wanted to run so many different workshops. So that's why it's taken us so long. But also the beauty of UX is that it's quite scalable across time, which has been really good. You can do it really quickly in 2 days, or you can take your time and do it over 10 weeks. So starting right back at discovery and back in Mural, but this time we noun foraged like crazy and have ran 20 workshops of over 2 hours each and still are doing them to this day. It's fair to say we talked endlessly about services, treatments, and the definition of those. And we have gone, we have more than 4 objects. I think we've got on the table about 10 now, but we have gained confidence that what's currently on the object map has gone through quite a rigorous process of validation. We've gone slightly rogue on the Mural template, apologies Sophia, and have started to separate, mostly for discussion purposes, our core objects. And also starting to think about potentially what's a candidate for navigation at this stage, just in conversation purposes. So objects which are core objects on the left, objects which are nested, unlikely contenders for a navigation item, and also our snowflake pages. So snowflake pages are things that just have to exist, like privacy, cookie statements, accessibility statements, etc. Plus in the NHS, we have a lot of statutory content, like reports and board minutes that have to be published, although thinking about them now, they are probably also objects in my map. Oops. So to inform this Uber round of ORCA that we're calling it in my team, we've analysed data from interview transcripts from user research, social media comments from across Facebook and Twitter, from both the NHS and private accounts, emails to our complaints service, friends and family surveys that have been collected, emails into our private inquiries team, PDFs, letters, strategy papers, welcome booklets. And this provided us with more than 10,000 words, from which we've foraged 2,596 nouns. We've done our manual count of these nouns, but if anyone knows of any tools which would do this counting automatically, then send them my way. And the benefit, as I said earlier, of using a range of sources is, for me, in order to strike that balance between looking at the words that our patients use when dealing with us and the language we use to communicate to our patients. Sometimes this is 2 very different things. For example, eye health versus ophthalmology. And we're still very much in the thick of it at ORCA. There are currently some workshops being spun up to get that validation piece in terms of our attributes and that prioritization, introducing people who haven't engaged with the process so far so we can get around to more of our stakeholders. And I'm expecting to uncover more questions and probably more objects. In fact, I hope I do. That's the point of this process. We hope to finish our 3rd run through by the end of March, and I plan to blog about it too. Well, I think I've got enough material now to write a short novel. I hope that time to get the fuzzy felt back out as well, hopefully. And as we continue to run through OOUX, we're also moving into a 3 areas team, which I'll just touch on now before summing up and opening up for questions. So remember the content audit I mentioned? Well, honestly, we didn't get very far with it. It's in its current version, mostly due to the lack of resource and time we had to dedicate to it. But then we hit an interesting conundrum once we had started on our OOUX journey. By this point, I should say that it became pretty apparent that completing the audit in its current form wouldn't have been that helpful to us. The majority of the HTML content was poor and out of date. Most of the good stuff is hidden in PDFs, over 4,000 of them. And we also knew that we were heading into a headless CMS world for 2 main reasons. One, to centralize the content model within the organization in order to remove duplication and to allow for reuse beyond just the website. And even beyond digital, i.e. letter creation. So now we have 3 things we want to do: work out what has value and what to keep, align this to our object map to identify gaps, and start collecting and storing that content in an object-based way ahead of CMS implementation. So I posted this with Sophia and Rik and some amazing cohort peeps last week, and they suggested looking at gather content as a stopgap solution. So now we're going to audit and collect our content at the same time. So that's yet to kick off, but seems like a sensible approach. Alongside this, I've been working really hard this year to get investment from the business to seek a supplier to get us to MVP later this year. And we are now in the final stages of our procurement phase and hope to engage with a supplier to start the next phase in April. All of the OOUX work in user discovery has shaped this procurement process, and I'm confident with all the work we have done today and continue to do so, that we can move quickly into an alpha phase with our supplier and start seeing this come to life into an actual product, of which the vision is to follow a user-centered design process to design and deliver a needs-based accessible digital service for patients, which supports both Moorfields' reputation as a world leader in eye care and patients in their own context. And I just wanted to sum up with some thoughts around what Moorfields has gained and what I have gained from OOUX. And the first point on the left is a quote that somebody said to me earlier. One of my colleagues said that they'd gained a fresh alternative lens on age-old problems. What is that debate about how we define service was instigated by looking at this and looking at this in detail, and having those conversations surface was, you know, absolutely brilliant. And it's great that another colleague is saying what value OOUX has brought to the organization. The ability to look at our offering and see it through a user mindset. Ability to think holistically about what we offer and how elements interact with each other. This one is my favorite. Being able to apply technical thinking, interactivity, functionality, requirements in a subtle, approachable way without even realizing it. Evidence and data, and therefore confidence in the direction of travel, and a new and exciting way to ensure users are front and center. And personally, confidence. I don't think I would have been able to implement OOUX at Moorfields if I hadn't have gained the confidence through the summer school and the cohort. New skills and approaches. I've built up my UX armory significantly with tools, techniques, templates, documents, and a new appreciation for Trello and Mural. Hopefully some friends and mentors for life, but also that things don't have to be pretty. I don't have to be a sketch master to be able to prototype easily. And also just one final thought, that I believe that OOUX enables you to keep one eye on the user and one on what's possible. And that's it. Thank you. I haven't been looking at the Q&A, so I have no idea what's happened.
What we thought we'd do is we thought, as both yourself and Gabriela are talking about case studies, it's probably best if we go to Gabriela's talk now, and then we can handle the Q&A for both of those at the end. I think that'll probably flow better in terms of the flow of the event. So Gabriela, if you'd like to go ahead and start.
Yes, let me start.
Yeah, that's great. We can see that. I think you might just need to be in presenter view.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
All right. Thanks everyone who stayed this late to listen to my talk. Thank you, Rik, also for the introduction earlier today. What I want to share with you is some of my experiences using object-oriented UX. I've been using this methodology since 2016. So I've had some examples to share. So yeah, let's get started. A little bit background about myself, because I don't think any of you know who I am. I am Gabriela Ospina, Venezuelan American, and I used to live in New York the last 9 years. Now I'm currently living and working in Frankfurt, Germany. Hello to those who are from Germany, if you're still here. I'm also an athlete, tennis being my favorite sport, and I'm a wanderlust soul, which is probably the reason why I moved to Germany, center of Europe, to travel. But then Corona happened. Currently, I am the senior product designer at Clark, which is an insurance manager company targeting the German market. If you have any questions at the end that I might not be able to get to, or if you want to just follow my adventures, you can follow me on social media with the handle Gabriela Ospina. Twitter, Instagram, Clubhouse. Maybe you can start some chats in there. All right, so I wanted to start with this quote by Robin Sharma. Change is hard at first, messy in the middle, and gorgeous at the end. I'm sure after all the talks that we've been hearing, you might be thinking, and I saw some questions in the chat, like how do we implement this? How do we get buy-in from everyone to start thinking differently, to start introducing a new methodology when things are working the way they are? So yeah, the first step is always hard. Trying to figure out the best way to get it done right is also hard, but at the end, we know it'll be worth it. So as I said, I've gone through many iterations of the messy middle. I'm still in search of the gorgeous phase. I haven't found that golden ticket that has given me the perfect solution for implementing it, but I have some things that I've seen have worked. So hopefully they'll help you as well trying to implement this into your organization. So yeah, startups, agency, corporate scale-ups, I have worked in all of those. And they all have different approaches to the discovery and development process, which depends mostly on the resources, the time, the project they're working on, and what their goal is. But as we're saying, like we all have a common problem, and which is complexity, either trying to reduce complexity, manage complexity, trying to deal with complexity. So I feel like object-oriented UX and the ORCA process has definitely helped me create a common ground to approaching the problem-solving phase in these environments. So far, it's going pretty great. At the beginning, it was not so good trying to figure out what's the best way to actually get this buy-in and teach what I was also learning. But yeah, so here's my journey and what I have done to introduce this method. The first thing, and what I hope it will be the easiest thing for you to start advocating for this in your organization, is some sort of lunch and learn. If there is already some space or a session like this in your organization, then it's just the easiest way to get people's time without any commitment. Lunch and learn is usually given to people that are willing to take in new ideas and try to find better ways to improve. So yeah, luckily at Clark, we do have brown bag sessions every 2 weeks. And I was recently able to share this object-oriented UX and ORCA process to the engineering team. Yeah, so after, or even if you don't do the lunch and learn, one of the other methods to also introduce this into smaller groups are 2 to 3 hours workshops. If you have the time, if you don't have time, 2 hours, try to at least get 2 hours. For the first hour, a little bit of lecture, explaining what the method is about, how does it work, and all the different stages of the ORCA process. And then the last 2 hours actually doing the exercises to get people going. Typically, these exercises should be done without the main problem that you're solving for, because then you'll get stuck thinking or having all the constraints that you know. So try to use another like made up product, a food app, or something that people can relate to easily. Yes, another way to get buy-in into this is by show and tell. If you don't really have time to explain what is it that's going on, it is, at least for me, I always do this process, even if it's by myself. The questions that I'm asking and like reaching out to other people are still part of the process. So by just creating the source template and showing them how I'm working or what is it that I am delivering. As a product designer, people always want to see visuals. And I don't have always like the pretty visuals. I'm usually like simple color coded wireframes that is very useful, at least for me. So if I know this is a step that it would be helpful for me and people want to know what is it that I'm doing, and if I have questions, then I show this in the format that I know later they will be get used to it. So this is an example of the OOUX wireframe, and this was for a conversation with the engineers, trying to understand what are the different pieces that we can incorporate. Can we do this or can we do this other thing, without really getting into the details of design? Because I feel like that was one of the biggest issues I always had at the beginning of my career. Like, instead of thinking about the actual attributes that made a component, then we were thinking about how big the logo was. So instead of that, like we were looking at, okay, the logo is gonna go here. Here are the different pieces that make up the different cars. What are like the things that we really need? So yeah, starting that conversation in the form of object-oriented UX. This is another example, and this was more targeted to the product manager and the experts. This was phase 2 of the ORCA process in the object definition, object requirement stage. And this came up because people were using different, as Sophia said, like just for the same thing, they were using different words. So by having this template of breaking down the definition, it helped the engineers and the product managers have a better understanding and ask more questions on what it was that we were doing, what we meant by an evaluation, what we meant by an advice. So this is currently a project I'm working on at Clark, and having such a diverse people with different backgrounds and not having English as the first language, this is a really important thing to do for us, so everyone understands what we mean by an evaluation and advice. Is a contract different than a product? And then the other one is pairing with front-end engineers. So if you're a solo designer or you don't have that close relationship with your PM, which I hope you do, this is another way to start getting the word out and start spreading the OOUX term around. So what I've done here, what I also try to do is just deliver the usual wireframe that you're trying to do if I don't do it at the beginning, but also overlay on top of it the objects and the attributes relationship to it. So the logo is going to go here, the category name, company name, rating, and this is also very helpful when it comes to design review, or if we're talking about the entire screen, then we know like this is what we're calling rating. We don't have to use too many words to describe what is it that we're referencing. So it's like if we have a comment about the rating, we just call it rating instead of like, oh yeah, the label with the dots on the top or the numbers of the days here. So by having clear definitions on the words and also using the breakdown to speak with your engineers, it will definitely help speed up the development process. So what are some things that I have learned or that I always try to keep in mind because probably it didn't go well one time the first thing is timing, like understanding when is the right time. There's never a right time or the best time to do it, but you need to understand or have a view on what your team is doing. If they're going through a lot of changes, it might not be the best time, or it actually might be the best time. At Clark, we're actually going through a lot of changes, and this is the perfect time for me to actually introduce the process, because the problem that we're trying to solve, I know will be easier if we do it with this method. But last year, I didn't talk about it. I've been at Clark for over a year, and I didn't really talk too much about it or try to spread the knowledge outside of my immediate team, because I didn't think it was going to be useful for other teams. So you gotta test the waters a little bit, see who is willing to take change, who will benefit from this at what point in their project, and then just start doing the things that I said at the beginning, lunch and learn, workshops, but they need to see and feel that they need this for them to actually take in and believe that they can benefit from this. Another thing is keep an overview. So introductions to the topic, keep those simple, because I know people will get scared if you start showing them all the 15 steps of the ORCA process or everything that really goes into it. People will be scared and they will not want to try it. So keep it simple. You show a little bit here and there. The most important parts, whatever's going to get you that buy-in, whoever you're talking to, if it's a PM, show them the object requirements template. If it's an engineer, show them the object wireframe. And if it's designers, show them like show them the website that you're working on and see how things change from here to there. And most likely it's because they didn't see the bigger picture of like how the objects are connecting and how one thing could move to the next. So yeah, having an ally is also very important. One person, two people are better than one. So if you find at least one more person that's interested in the subject, that will help you champion like the value of the method, that is very important. If you're the only one and you're the only one that believes in it, then it's definitely hard. Like Imogen said, it's easier to get people from outside. But if you can't get people from outside to tell others that it is important, definitely try to get an internal ally to convey and work on showing the value of the method. Another thing is to have alternatives. Find different ways to incorporate pieces of the process. It's important to know your rules. So you do need to know like all your 15 steps and how they build up on each other to then be able to break the rules. So you need to know your rules to be able to break the rules. So yeah, find alternatives to ways to incorporate the pieces. As I said before, if you're talking to engineers, start feeding them that. If that doesn't work, then try a different way, but never give up. There's always one piece of or another in the entire process that you can use to showcase the value of this. You're still good. Like I still do it, even if I don't get buy-in from other people. I know it's important for me, so I do all 15 steps. I might do one step before the other, or I might skip some because we might already have the information and we don't need it. But it is important to do the entire process, but know which ones to show. So if one piece didn't work, if one step didn't work, then go for the next one. But yes, find alternative to incorporate this into the process, and people will eventually start connecting the dots and knowing why you were doing what you were doing and why you were showing this colored coded links before. I think I didn't look at the clock, but I'm sure I talked pretty fast because that's what I do. So yeah, at the end of the day, just keep it simple, simplify as much as you can. I think there was a question about how complex it has to be able to use OOUX. It can be as simple as possible. The simplest, the better, actually. One example that I can share with is when I was at JP Morgan working on the mobile dashboard of the investment side. They were trying to complicate things too much. And by showing the object map and reducing the amount of objects that we had, and going back to the problems and asking the product managers, are the users going into the mobile app for these things? Then we don't need all these things down here. So simplify it. It doesn't matter how big or small your project is. I think it still has value on all of those. So I guess I'll stop sharing. I'll look at the.
Thank you, Gabriela.
Yeah, I guess we'll look at some questions now.
So yeah, we have some questions in the Q&A panel. If the speakers would like to pick which ones that they feel are the most juicy or most debatable, please feel free to go ahead. Just also a reminder, if anyone does want to ask a question in person, please raise your hand in the attendee panel or the participants panel, and we can unmute you so you can ask the question in person.
I might just jump in with the question of how much of the things you produce in Orca do you keep up to date? Well, I think because we've been running the Orca process again, we've been actually just building on each of the stuff that we've created in each of the rounds that we've done it. So like all of them, I guess, to answer your question, because each time we identify either new objects or we uncover a new definition, or we start having the fight between, do we keep services or get rid of treatments? What is it? How do we define it? And so we're constantly building on the assets and things that we created. So the object guide, the CTA matrix, the mural board is a good place to start. But then you kind of end up in Trello, and mostly the activity comes in sort of Trello. So it becomes really easy to keep those things up to date. I don't know if anyone else agrees with that, or does it in a different way.
I'll add to that. So about like when I update, so the question of like, often stuff will change when you start sketching. So hopefully you will have figured out 80 to 90% of that complexity. But when you start sketching, you start visualizing, you're like, oh, here's another piece I want to add, or I want to break up these pieces, or this other piece, like now that I'm visualizing it, maybe it doesn't make as much sense. So those will be smaller changes. So you'll definitely have changes once you get into wireframing, but they'll just be less than what you might otherwise have. The question is, do you go back and do you update that object map? So I'm in sketching or I'm in prototyping and I add something. Do I go back and update the object map? And that is, are your developers working from the object map? So what in your case is the source of truth? So if the source of truth becomes your prototype, then you can kind of sunset those previous artifacts. But if it is a beautiful thing to have your developers working from that object map, actually have collaborated on the object map with you. So you have worked with them to figure out the data model. And the cool thing is they can be working from that object map to be doing back-end technical architecture. They can start building that API. They can start cleaning up that data over there. They can start figuring out this little algorithm that we need over here while you're working on the front end. So you are no longer a bottleneck, which is cool. So then you can say like, okay, I'm sketching this thing out. Oh, I want to add this piece of metadata. Let me pop it back into Trello, mention the dev team, say, hey, I've added this piece of information here. This is going to be in the wireframe. And they're like, okay, cool. We need a popularity. What does popularity mean? And you can have that conversation. So it kind of depends, I guess. Yeah, I agree. I usually don't go back unless I know that people are, or like someone is going to be looking at that and referencing in the meantime. So yeah, right now I am going back into the object map and updating as I go, just because I know people are actually looking at the object map.
There's one that's specifically Moorfields, I think. I'm wondering why you keep location as an object and not as an attribute of service or appointment. Good question. Moorfields is not in just one location. So I think that's the primary candidate for why it's an object. It has instances. It also is defined. So we have the main flagship hospital, but we have what's called satellite sites in other hospitals around the UK, but we also other hospitals. So it's enough for it to exist on its own. It has its own structure, it has its own instances, and it has its own purpose in that sense. And there's going to be loads of different actions that you are going to take that are going to be different from. So for example, some of our locations outside of the main flagship hospital only treat certain conditions. So some of those actions are going to be different or restricted versus what you can do at the kind of flagship hospital, which might be everything. So again, another reason why it's not an attribute just on, it's a nested object within services and appointments.
So if you think about that structure, if I remember, I mean, you have contact information, so like phone number, address, the name of the location, the actual geolocation, hours too, and then so now you're starting to get into a structure, maybe even an image of the, so that's that S of the SIP process. And once you have structure to it, like you have to define the structure.
Yeah, and also we've now identified, so location is an interesting one because you have the location of the hospital, so say City Road in London, for example, but then you have sub-location. So now we've got another object, which is a sub-location of Clinic 1 or Clinic 2. So you've got locations within the locations of where to go for your appointment or your treatment. So again, another candidate there, another object that has its own structure and its own instances, but very much nested within sort of the parent of, City Road location, for example. So I hope that answers the question. Good question though.
Should we take on the Scrum Agile question?
That is a really, really good question. Matthias has got some strong ones.
So yes, I can understand how it might feel waterfall. And what I would say is I think that there's major issues with Scrum and Agile. Ooh. So I think that the pendulum, we got burned by waterfall and we basically had this revolution and the pendulum swung all the way to the other side, which basically meant we don't do any holistic thinking. We don't have any time to think. We're just this feature factory. We're like, oh, I listened to, I've been really enjoying the What Is Wrong with UX podcast. And the ladies on that podcast were talking, that scene where Lucille Ball is eating the chocolates on the chocolate, you know what I'm talking about? Where she's eating because the conveyor belt is going and they can't go fast enough. Like, this is what we're in. We're in these feature factories where we also have forgotten the whole feedback loop. So often we get the feature out there and then we just go to the next feature. We go to the next piece of functionality. We don't actually iterate on it where we go and we get feedback. So research, this is what UX designers are always complaining about. When am I supposed to do research? And when am I supposed to do holistic information architecture? Because information architecture, you can't think of a cog in the machine. Information architecture is all about thinking about how that machine works as a whole. In Agile, way too much, we get into this thinking about each individual little cog, or even worse, each individual little function. And then we get with these Frankenstein designs. Okay, calm down, Sophia, calm down. So I think what we need to do is we need to kind of, the truth lies somewhere in between. The way to make products is not to be a feature factory. It's also not to spend 2 years in design and write a 500-page spec. Like, maybe there's a compromise, right? Maybe there's something in between that's going to work better to build products, because you know what? We're still building shit technology. Humanity is still freaking mad at us, right? Nobody likes technology. People are mad. People don't like, I don't think that we're building technology that is humane, that actually works for how the brain works. So it's not really working, right? So what I would say is can we take 4 weeks to figure out our information architecture so that then we can prioritize better? We can divide that complexity up by object instead of by divided up by noun. And then our sprints just look different. So then we still iterate, we get feedback on it, and we continue to grow a system that started out as a simple system. You cannot, I'm pulling from a quote that I've been using a lot by a guy named John Gall, who I'm going to butcher the quote, I need you to just memorize it. But you can't just start with a complex system. any complex system that works started as a simple system. All right. So first we have to create that simple system, and then we iterate on it there by saying, like, let's upgrade this object. Let's add, now let's add the ability to do this other thing to this object that we couldn't do to this object before. Let's roll in a new object. So we can still be iterative. We can still do sprints, but you don't want your information architecture to be that iterative because it's expensive. Like, think about the house metaphor. I don't want to be iterating on my architecture of the house. I don't want to be iterating on where the walls go and where the plumbing goes. I want to iterate on, you know, where my furniture is, maybe even where my fixtures are, where my lighting is, but I don't want to iterate on the walls. So we kind of want to get that right. And maybe look at that, you know, every year, every few years we spend, like, what if we just spent once a year, we spent 4 weeks on this type of work, and then prioritize from that. So that's what I would say. I'm going to step off my soapbox now. I'm going to put myself on mute and see if anybody else has anything to say about that.
I don't think anyone can follow that. I agree.
Feel free to fight me in the comments. I'll be over there.
I would never fight Sophia. Oh my God, wow. I think that there's a question at the top, which is, any tips on how to manage nouns when different users have different nouns for the same thing? What is the thing? Isn't that the thing? So you will identify lots of different labels for the same thing, but I guess the thing is, it doesn't really matter. In some ways, we are at Morphos just using working definitions internally for some of the objects at the moment, because we're not at the stage of developing navigation or IA for real. But we have identified all of the different synonyms, and part of writing the object guide is that you capture all of those different synonyms that people use to describe. So location is just a working title for one of the objects. That might not be the final label. Obviously, you know, we would go into testing later on. Once we've got our IA, we might do some tree jack testing later on to test some of those labels. We might do lots of other testing to test some of the language, but at the moment it's working definitions, but we've captured and identified all the different things that people are telling us, and generally we've used the most common label that people use, because there are going to be patterns, and part of the counting that we did was to get some of that data, to get some of that kind of quantitative data of counting how many people use the word location, or is it something else that they use? How do other people describe conditions? How do people describe services? Well, that's obviously been a massive conundrum for us, but it's really important to kind of capture all of those, and your object guide will enable you to do that. I don't know if anyone else has some thoughts about how to deal with nouns. It's fun. I love that part.
I think Sandy asked initially the question is, what happens if a process has started and you need to retrofit? Is that possible, and how would that work? And I think that's probably a good one for all three of you to contribute on.
Yeah, so I'll speak to that. So that's the question from Sandy. How can one apply this process to a project that has already started, especially if it's gone quite far? Mm-hmm. I would love to hear Imogen and Gabriela's answer. I would say that, like, it's never too late. Like, again, like, a little OOUX is better than none. If you are, depending again, like, what kind of development environment you're in, if you are like more in a waterfall scenario versus agile, I would say fit it in where you can and see where you can kind of squeeze it in. That's kind of a bad answer, but I would also say if you're in like wireframing and visual design, go and ask yourself those questions. Like, look at your system and say, do I understand what the objects are? Like, what are the valuable things here? Am I representing them consistently? Look for those shapeshifters and masked objects. So am I representing two things that are very different? And am I putting them in the exact same outfit? Well, maybe make some small tweaks there from the visual perspective so that, you know, maybe even just like changing the ratio of them, simple things that are not going to be a huge dev effort or anything, just visual design things to make them look different. And then, oh, well, crap, because I wasn't thinking an object. This thing is manifesting on these 2 separate pages, and I have all these arbitrary changes because I was designing page by page versus thinking about these objects. So I was moving stuff around arbitrarily. Now, if you had good reasons to move things around, okay, sometimes shapeshifters make sense, but just remember that you are sacrificing consistency, that there's a cost to that. So if you're designing in context, make sure it's not an assumption, that it is research backed, that you are actually have research that shows that that attribute is more important in this scenario. Otherwise, just keep it the same. It's going to be better. Just be conservative when it comes to shapeshifting and research backed. And so watch out for those 2 no-nos. Watch out also, like, for every action, how are we rooting it in? So kind of basically audit your existing wireframes or artifacts from an OUX perspective and see what kind of quick fixes you can do. And then if you have time, do go back and try to do some object mapping, even if you're spending 4 hours doing it. And you might say, oh, well, when we do this, like, there's actually this piece of metadata, or there's a connection between these 2 objects that we're not making right now. So for example, of like, let's say you're working in ed tech. I use that as an example because I worked in ed tech for a while, and you realize, like the software that I was building, students and classes are only connected one way. So I can go to a student and I can see the classes that they're in, but if I go to the class detail page, I can't see my students. That's a true story. And say, okay, there is a clear connection in the user's mental model that a class has many students and a student has many classes, but we are not manifesting that connection. So can we just go and, like, make sure to add student cards to the class detail page so that we can bring that connection together? So kind of working backwards a little bit.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I'm not sure I have anything else to add other than, like, it depends how far, I guess. Like, you know, if you've already got into wireframes, obviously, you know, there's lots you can do there to identify masks, objects, shapeshifters, all of those good things that you can kind of identify. If you haven't quite got that far yet, the beauty of OOUX is that nobody showed the double diamond. I'm surprised that nobody had that on any of their slides. But normally the double diamond process, the OOUX fits really nicely in the middle. So after you've done some user research and you've got you've defined your problem space, cue object oriented UX. That is the beauty of when the process really comes into its own and really sparks some of those questions and really makes you think way before you're touching any kind of wireframe, as Sophia said, that you've identified the relationships, that you start bringing in your developer in to have some of those conversations, that, you know, you're really thinking about system design, but actually you are, oh, I don't know what Rik's showing here, but yeah, it depends how far. The double diamond, yay. It fits really nicely here, but it could fit at any point of that journey, I think. It's kind of the point I was trying to make, but it fits really nicely before stuff is kind of sketched, but also at the point of wireframing, as Sophia said, you can start identifying where some of those problems might be. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
Yeah, I don't think like any project has gone too far. Like, there's always time to go back. If the user still has a problem, then we need to fix it. So even if it's out in production, if you identify that there is a problem with your information architecture, then this is the perfect time. So there's no too far into the project where you cannot fix things. It's technology too, so it's easy to fix things. We just need time.
Yes, definitely. Rik, send us the link of that article.
I need to finish it. I've been working on that for like a year.
Okay, it's not published.
Yeah, that's a sneak peek. I just stepped into this. It's the easiest way to get that really good double diamond from Havana.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Amanda for illustrating it. So Chris wants us to look at, I know there's a couple more questions. Feel free to ask us on Twitter. All of us are on Twitter. You can also, what are other good ways? LinkedIn, definitely connect with me on LinkedIn, ask that question there if you want. But I think Chris wants us to focus on the reflecting on your experience so far. What's one thing you would do differently using Orca? And my answer is going to be my answer is easy and silly. I would have put my foot down sooner with my clients. As a consultant, I spent a few years kind of trying to sneak it in and taking on clients that did not want to work this way. I stopped that like in 2017, 2018, and I just wish I'd started it sooner. I just wish I'd done more of it. It's my backhanded answer.
For me, I would have focused more on the object definition, trying to really understand what was the thing and what was it made out of. I think we even using OOUX before without like the orca process and the template of the object definition, we always were too high level on that. And there were too many questions that were not answered because we didn't get into the nitty gritty of the details of the object. So focusing more on what the object is and what are the relationships and what it was supposed to do.
Yeah, I think for me, it's in the cohort, I was really scared of the relationship part of Orca and how to actually run workshops on that when I went back to Moorfields. And so the first few workshops that we did, we just focused on noun foraging and defining objects, coming up with some instances of those objects and jumping to the sea and leaving the R because I was too scared. But actually, that's the thing that recently I've kind of had more of an epiphany on, and being able and having that confidence to go back to the business and actually asking, okay, what is the relationship between a condition and a consultant? Is there one? Is there a relationship with a consultant and themselves? I don't know. And actually, I've really had to build up a little bit of that confidence, but I would spend more time on the R than I probably did, originally when I threw it out at Moorfields.
I just want to pop in. I'm answering some of these questions. I'm typing them and they go over to the answered section. So make sure to look over in the answered section of the Q&A. There was a question on semantic interaction design. I'm guessing you're talking about UX magic, Dan R. So we're friends. I put in I don't know where it went though, but there's a link in there. Oh, I'll put it in the chat too, to the OOUX happy hour where Dan Rosenberg spoke. So we're on the same page when it comes to semantic UX. Right.
Are there any final questions from anyone? I'm happy to leave the meeting open. I am just aware, obviously, our speakers and many of the attendees will have other, family commitments or, in their work day. So I'm happy to leave the meeting open for the conversations to continue. I mean, Rik, if you had anything to say to kind of formally close the event, I can see there are still some questions. So if the speakers are happy to stay on for a while and answer them, I think that's appropriate. But Rik, if you had any final comments, generally.
Only to say thank you so much to Sophia, Imogen, and Gabriela. It's a super juicy area and super juicy examples and insights. Next week is World IA, not next week, but next Thursday, I think, is World IA Day. So do check out all of the World IA Day site. And I certainly know that Interaction Design London will be running a related event for that, closely affiliated, obviously, to OOUX and other IA methods.
And just personally, Rik, I'd like to say a big thank you for you, for putting this event together, and a big thank you to all the speakers for, I think we actually had our highest attendance for a remote event. So that just shows the interest.
OOUX for the win!
Exactly, it just shows the interest that you generated and you all generated. And thanks to all the attendees, like I say, I mean, we will keep doing these events remotely as long as we have attendees. So you really make the evening for us. And also a big shout out to some of our colleagues, our UPA colleagues over in Germany. I'm not sure if you're still on the call, but it's great to see you in attendance, and hopefully perhaps we can collaborate on an event later this year. Still,
that would be cool.
So I think formally we'll close the event, but like I say, I'm happy to leave the meeting open. The meeting will stay open as long as one of the hosts are on, which is either myself, Rik, or one of the speakers. So if you're happy to ask questions in the Q&A panel, if you want to be unmuted, just raise your hand in the participants panel and ask away. Other than that, I'd like to, thank you all again for joining us, whatever time of the day it is there. And don't forget to join us next month on the 25th, I believe it was. 25th of March is the next date for the diary. And keep an eye on the newsletter. So if you haven't signed up, go to our website for that. And also, we'll try to get a recording of the session on YouTube as soon as practically possible. So thank you all. We'll close it formally there, but like I say,